The Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron, has flown to Washington, D.C. And incidentally, the D.C. stands for the District of Columbia, not David Cameron. Cities have not yet been named in his honour. He has to hold talks with his American counterparts on a range of international issues, including the wars in both Israel and Ukraine, as well as meeting members of Congress from both the Republican and Democratic parties. Expected to be on Lord Cameron's agenda for these meetings is the opposition from Senate Republicans to the President Biden's aid package of $106 billion for both Ukraine and Israel. Republicans have cited a lack of essential new immigration restrictions to balance domestic security with foreign aid to justify their approach. However, the backlash towards foreign aid for Ukraine is not new within the American right. Since the war broke out in February 22, right-wing voices such as Tucker Carlson have taken an America First approach to foreign aid. But these isolationist ideas seem to be gaining support as the war grinds inexorably on. The Foreign Office said part of Lord Cameron's diplomatic mission to the US capital is to reaffirm unwavering support for Ukraine. So is this stirring of discontent towards the principle actually a threat to historic UK-US relations? Well, with me now is the chairman of the Republicans overseas in the UK, Greg Swenson. Greg, thank you for coming in once more. You're always a welcome visitor here. From a British point of view, it's the Conservative Party that led the support for Ukraine. It was Boris Johnson who did this. And our friends in the Republican Party now seem to want to let Ukraine hang out to dry. Yeah, can this be right?
There's some concern. I don't think the party in general wants to let Ukraine hang out to dry. In fact, the majority of senators are for it, and specifically Mitch McConnell is the minority leader. So the Senate is behind Ukraine and wants to support it. There is a wing of the Republican House where they have the majority that has some concerns. The incrementalism that Biden has executed during the whole conflict, the lack of vision on what's the end game, what does winning really mean, you know. So I think there's some concerns, but it's not the majority. And I think there is a wing of the party that is pushed back. But Mike Johnson, for example, the new Speaker of the House, he is for supporting Ukraine. But I think it's a little tone deaf of David Cameron to not consider the fact that taxpayers are concerned about costs because of the reckless spending by the Biden administration the last almost 3 years, but also the open border is a complete disaster. You know, Biden's polling at 32 on immigration and the border. He's polling only at 40 on just about everything else, or high 30s. But, you know, he's really got a problem. This is something that Biden could solve.
So could you explain for me how this works? Because aid to Ukraine and the Mexican border don't seem directly related. What's going on in Congress that brings the two together?
It really is just, you know, what are the most important issues? And the Biden administration has created the border, and yet he refuses to acknowledge that there's a problem, which is unthinkable. We have 8 million illegal immigrants in the last 3 years. It'll be 10 at the end of Biden's first term. So, you know, this is a real disaster. So there's frustration on the right that the president refuses to address this, and the Democrats in the House and Senate. So there is some frustration. Yes, it's apples and oranges. They shouldn't necessarily be related. But this is an easy win for Biden, because all he has to do is make a concession on the border, on some simple border policies that will stop this crazy immigration. And it's a win because it'll help him in the general election with the independents and the moderates, and at the same time, it'll get his money for Ukraine. Win-win.
Okay, except he could look at it the other way around and say the Republicans want to help Ukraine, they don't want Russia to win, and therefore if I hold firm, the Republicans will have to allow us to have this money, and particularly Israel, where the Republicans have been much more supportive of Israel than the Democrats.
And a much smaller number, of course, but I think, again, you know, there's over $100 billion has gone already to Ukraine. He's pitching another 61. You know, David Cameron made a good point in one of his talks that, you know, it is the most powerful economy in the world. It is the greatest military in the world. But there's limits to that. And I think the voters are really frustrated with this lack of interest in any kind of constraints on spending. But generally speaking, this could be passed tomorrow if they would just make some compromise. So all this talk that Biden had in the campaign, I'm the compromise guy, I can work with the other side, This is an opportunity. Just make some concessions on the border. It doesn't have to give the Republicans everything. Just give them something.
And does the Russian cyber attack change people's view in any way, and that Russia looks more dangerous to all of us, not just to Ukraine?
I think that will be a factor, and I think it's about time. I mean, I'm surprised it took this long for the announcement today. But this is kind of old news for us in the U.S., because there was some tampering in 2016 when some Russians hacked into Hillary Clinton's emails and released them. But there's some credibility issues here with the West, and there's also kind of a boy who cried wolf moment. The Russia collusion hoax was a complete fabrication made up by the Hillary Clinton campaign and spread by current National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. The 51 former intelligence officials that said that the Hunter Biden laptop looked and smelled like Russian disinformation, that was a fabrication by the Biden campaign and Anthony Blinken, who's now Secretary of State. So, this is something that Americans will probably just look at it and say, yeah, okay, the Russians, can't trust them, but we've made up a lot of stuff about them.
And to what extent do we Brits, overestimate the influence that we're likely to have? David Cameron goes out, he's very charming, very polished, highly intellectual.
Sure.
Do people think, oh goodness, the British Foreign Secretary's come and that's interesting, or do they think their defence budget's a fraction of ours, they need to ante up if we're going to take them seriously?
I think it's more the challenge is that most Americans probably don't know who he is.
They know who Boris is.
Well, yes, of course, but because he was front page news quite a bit. But I think it's good that David Cameron, any foreign secretary from the UK, to be over in Washington, to keep that relationship warm. So I think that's a good move. But do the voters and even most of the congressmen really care what his view is? Without acknowledging, he did say, I don't want to get involved with how Congress works, but without acknowledging the frustration of the taxpayers with the reckless spending and the open border, which makes the boat crisis here look like a rounding error. I mean, this is, the 10 million, that's bigger than
10
all
million,
but 20 states.
10 million is a lot. Well, thank you very much, Greg.